October 1947. In the Mojave Desert, a bright orange bullet-shaped plane hangs beneath a B-29 bomber like a deadly ornament. The world doesn't know its name. The Soviets laugh at the very idea. A plane faster than sound? Impossible. Engineers call it suicide. Physicists speak of walls of air that will tear metal apart like tissue paper. But inside the cramped cockpit sits a young test pilot with 2 broken ribs, a stick of chewing gum in his mouth, and an American flag stitched to his sleeve. His name is Chuck Yeager, and he's about to prove that physics has limits. And courage does not. The desert stretches endlessly below, white as bone under the morning sun. In a few moments, this man will climb into the sky and shatter more than just the sound barrier. He will crack open the future itself, silencing doubters, stunning enemies, and launching America toward the stars. This is the story of the moment America stopped explaining and started flying. The moment we discovered that some barriers exist only until someone is brave enough to break them. But to understand how we got here, to this orange rocket suspended between Earth and heaven, we need to go back to a time when the speed of sound felt as distant and impossible as the surface of the moon. The X-1 program established its headquarters at Muroc Army Airfield in California's Mojave Desert, a vast expanse of alkali flats and Joshua trees that would later become Edwards Air Force Base. The location had been chosen for its isolation and its weather. Endless clear skies, minimal air traffic, and room for aircraft to crash without killing anyone on the ground. Muroc was also a place where secrets could be kept. The base was surrounded by restricted airspace, patrolled by military police, and officially didn't exist according to most government records. Reporters were banned, camera equipment was confiscated, and personnel were required to sign security agreements that could land them in federal prison if violated. The desert itself became a character in the X-1 story. During the day, temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, creating shimmering heat mirages that made distant mountains appear to float in mid-air. At night, the temperature plunged below freezing, and the stars burned with an intensity rarely seen in more populated areas. It was a landscape that seemed designed for testing the limits of human ambition, vast, hostile, and utterly indifferent to the dreams of the men who had come to challenge the sky. Before Yeager could attempt to break the sound barrier, he and the Bell team needed to understand how the X-1 behaved at various speeds. The aircraft's rocket engine could be throttled to provide different levels of thrust, allowing for a careful, methodical approach to Mach 1. The first powered flight took place on August 29, 1947, with Yeager coaxing the X-1 to a modest Mach 0.85. The aircraft handled smoothly, responding to control inputs much like a conventional fighter. The rocket engine provided tremendous acceleration. Yeager described the sensation as being shot out of a cannon, but otherwise the flight was routine. Mach 0.9 was a different story. At 9/10 the speed of sound, the X-1 began to exhibit the same dangerous characteristics that had killed other test pilots. The aircraft bucked and shuddered as shock waves formed over its wings. The control stick grew heavy, then began to vibrate so violently that Yeager could barely maintain his grip. "It was like riding a bucking bronco," Yeager radioed to the ground crew. "Every rivet in this thing is rattling." But the X-1 held together. Bell's engineers had designed the aircraft to withstand far greater stresses than any conventional fighter could survive. The tiny wings, which had looked so inadequate on the ground, proved to be perfectly suited for high-speed flight. Instead of generating massive shock waves, they sliced through the air with minimal disturbance. Mach 0.95 brought new challenges. The shock waves intensified, creating a region of turbulent air around the aircraft that made precise control nearly impossible. Yeager found himself fighting to keep the X-1 level as invisible forces tried to flip it into an unrecoverable spin. More alarmingly, the aircraft's elevator, the control surface that governed pitch, began to lose effectiveness. This was the phenomenon that had doomed other supersonic attempts. As shock waves disrupted the airflow over the tail, pilots found themselves unable to control their aircraft's attitude, leading to catastrophic dives or stalls. But Bell's engineers had anticipated this problem. Working from captured German research, they had equipped the X-1 with an adjustable horizontal stabilizer. Essentially, the entire tail could be tilted up or down to maintain pitch control even when the elevator became ineffective. The system worked, but barely. At Mach 0.96, Yeager was fighting the aircraft constantly, making tiny adjustments to the stabilizer trim to keep the nose from dropping or rising uncontrollably. By early October 1947, the X-1 had reached Mach 0.97, closer to the speed of sound than any aircraft had ever flown, and returned to tell the tale. The project team knew they were on the verge of something historic, but they also understood the enormous risks involved. Soviet criticism intensified as news of the X-1 program began to leak. Radio Moscow broadcast increasingly shrill denunciations of American recklessness and suicidal obsession with impossible speeds. One Soviet commentator declared that the X-1 program was a monument to capitalist arrogance that would end in the inevitable destruction of aircraft and pilot. Even within the American military establishment, doubts were growing. The X-1 program was expensive, consuming resources that could have been used to develop more conventional military aircraft. Some Pentagon officials questioned whether breaking the sound barrier was worth the risk to valuable test pilots and experimental aircraft. Colonel Boyd faced mounting pressure to either achieve success quickly or shut down the program. The brass wanted results, not excuses. Meanwhile, Chuck Yeager was dealing with a more immediate problem. His body was falling apart. 2 days before the planned Mach 1 attempt, Yeager had decided to celebrate what might be his last night on Earth by going horseback riding with his wife Glennis at a local dude ranch. The evening had gone well until Yeager, showing off for his wife, had attempted to race his horse through a gate in near darkness. The horse had seen the gate. Yeager had not. He was thrown hard, landing on his right side with enough force to crack 2 ribs. Any sensible person would have reported the injury and postponed the flight until he recovered. But Chuck Yeager was not any sensible person. He was a test pilot, a member of a fraternity that considered physical pain to be just another form of data to be processed and overcome. More importantly, Yeager understood the political pressures surrounding the X-1 program. A delay now might mean cancellation. The Soviets would claim vindication of their skepticism. American prestige would suffer another blow in the increasingly tense Cold War competition. So Yeager said nothing about his injuries. He showed up at Muroc the next morning, walking carefully but giving no indication that anything was wrong. The only person he told was Jack Ridley, the project's flight engineer, and only because he needed help solving a practical problem. With his ribs cracked, he couldn't generate enough force to close the X-1's heavy cockpit hatch. Ridley's solution was elegantly simple. He found a broom handle, sawed off about 10 inches, and gave it to Yeager as a lever. By positioning the makeshift tool correctly, Yeager could use his left arm to operate the hatch closure mechanism without straining his injured ribs. It was a perfect metaphor for the entire X-1 program. American ingenuity applied to seemingly impossible problems, with life or death consequences riding on solutions that cost less than $1 and could be improvised in a maintenance hangar. The morning of October 14, 1947, dawned clear and cold over Muroc Army Airfield. The desert air was still and crystalline, unmarked by clouds or wind. Perfect conditions for making aviation history or dying in the attempt. Chuck Yeager arrived at the flight line before sunrise, moving carefully to avoid aggravating his broken ribs. He wore his standard flight gear, a brown leather jacket, khaki flight suit, and a cloth helmet that looked more appropriate for barnstorming than breaking the sound barrier. No pressure suit, no special equipment, just a man and his courage, preparing to challenge the fundamental forces of nature. The X-1 hung beneath the modified B-29 bomber like a bright orange torpedo, its rocket engine nozzles gleaming in the pre-dawn light. Ground crews bustled around the aircraft, checking systems, topping off fuel tanks, and making final adjustments to instruments that had never been tested at supersonic speeds. The rocket plane's official designation was XS-1 number 46062, but Yeager had christened it Glamorous Glennis in honor of his wife. The name was painted in elegant script below the cockpit, a touch of personal warmth on a machine designed for violence against the atmosphere itself. Jack Ridley approached Yeager with the sawed-off broom handle, tucking it discreetly into the pilot's jacket. Neither man spoke about the injury, but both understood the stakes. If Yeager couldn't properly seal the cockpit hatch, the flight would have to be scrubbed. The program might be canceled. The Soviets would claim another propaganda victory. The weight of American prestige rested on 10 inches of painted wood. Inside the hangar, Bell Aircraft's engineers made their final preparations with the precision of priests preparing for Mass. Every system had been checked and rechecked. Every contingency had been planned for except the most likely one: catastrophic failure at Mach 1. Robert Woods, the X-1's chief designer, walked slowly around the aircraft one last time, his trained eye searching for any detail that might have been overlooked. The rocket plane was a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering, but it was also an experiment in applied physics whose outcome could not be predicted with certainty. The X-1's rocket engine was a marvel in itself, capable of producing 6,000 pounds of thrust by burning a mixture of liquid oxygen and diluted ethyl alcohol. The propellants were kept in separate tanks and mixed only in the combustion chamber, creating a controlled explosion that would either propel Yeager into the history books or scatter his remains across the Mojave Desert. Unlike conventional aircraft engines, the rocket motor could operate at any altitude, including the vacuum of space. This made it perfect for high-altitude flight, where the thinner air would reduce both drag and the speed of sound itself. At 40,000 feet, the speed of sound was only about 660 miles per hour, significantly lower than the 767 mph required at sea level. But the rocket engine consumed fuel at a horrifying rate. The X-1 carried enough propellant for only about 4 minutes of powered flight. 4 minutes to accelerate from subsonic speeds to beyond Mach 1, collect data about supersonic flight characteristics, and prepare for the powerless glide back to Earth. 4 minutes to prove that humanity could break the chains that physics had wrapped around human ambition. At 6:00 a.m., Yeager climbed aboard the B-29 mothership for the flight to altitude. The bomber, nicknamed the Fertile Myrtle, had been extensively modified to carry the X-1 beneath its belly. The rocket plane fit into a specially designed bomb bay, suspended by explosive bolts that could release it at the pilot's command. The arrangement looked precarious, but it solved several critical problems. Taking off under rocket power would have required enormous amounts of fuel, leaving little for the supersonic flight itself. Worse, the X-1's landing gear was designed for the smooth surface of a dry lakebed, not the abuse of repeated conventional takeoffs. By carrying the X-1 to altitude, the B-29 allowed the rocket plane to begin its mission with full fuel tanks and minimal wear on its delicate systems. It also provided a measure of safety. If something went wrong with the X-1, Yeager could simply abort the mission and glide down to a dead-stick landing. The flight to 20,000 feet took 45 minutes, during which Yeager reviewed his flight plan one final time. The mission profile was deceptively simple. Drop from the B-29, ignite the rocket engine, accelerate in level flight to maximum speed, then glide home. But simplicity masked enormous complexity. The X-1 had never been flown faster than Mach 0.97. No one knew for certain what would happen when it reached Mach 1. The shock waves that had made previous flights so violent might intensify beyond the aircraft's structural limits. The control surfaces might lose effectiveness entirely, leaving Yeager trapped in an uncontrollable projectile. Theoretical calculations suggested that the aircraft would survive the transition to supersonic flight, but theory and reality had an unfortunate tendency to diverge at the worst possible moments. At 20,000 feet above the Mojave Desert, Chuck Yeager lowered himself through a hatch in the B-29's bomb bay and squeezed into the X-1's cramped cockpit. The space was barely large enough for a man of average build, with instruments and controls packed around the pilot's seat like the contents of a Swiss watch. Yeager strapped himself in, connected his oxygen mask and radio headset, and began the pre-flight checklist. Every switch and dial had to be in exactly the right position before the explosive bolts could be fired. A single error could turn the X-1 into an unguided missile with a human passenger. The most critical system was the rocket engine's ignition sequence. Unlike conventional engines, which could be started gradually and allowed to warm up, the X-1's rocket motor went from 0 to maximum power in less than a second. There was no throttle in the conventional sense, only switches that controlled which of the 4 rocket chambers were firing at any given moment. Yeager tested each system methodically, his voice calm and professional as he reported his status to the ground controllers at Muroc. The broken ribs caused sharp stabs of pain every time he reached for a switch or control lever, but he gave no indication of discomfort over the radio. At exactly 10 o'clock a.m., the B-29's pilot announced, "Ready for drop on your mark, Chuck." Yeager took a deep breath and pulled out Jack Ridley's makeshift lever. Using his left arm, he forced the cockpit hatch closed and locked it in place. The broom handle had done its job perfectly, but now Yeager was sealed inside a machine that had never been tested at the speeds he was about to attempt. "Drop," he said quietly. The explosive bolts fired with a sharp crack, and suddenly the X-1 was falling free through the thin desert air. For a few seconds, the only sound in Yeager's headset was the whistle of wind over the X-1's sleek fuselage. The aircraft fell like a stone, building up speed as it descended toward the thicker air below. Yeager used this time to familiarize himself with the rocket plane's flight characteristics, making small adjustments to trim and control position. Then he pushed the ignition switch. The rocket engine erupted to life with a violence that defied description. One moment Yeager was falling through space in near silence. The next, he was being crushed back into his seat by an acceleration that made combat maneuvering feel gentle by comparison. The X-1 shot forward like a bullet fired from God's own rifle. Yeager had experienced the rocket engine's power during previous test flights, but it never failed to astonish him. In less than 30 seconds, the aircraft accelerated from 200 miles per hour to over 600 mph. The desert floor blurred past below as the X-1 climbed toward its test altitude of 42,000 feet. At Mach 0.85, the first shock waves began to form over the aircraft's wings. Yeager felt the familiar buffeting that had characterized all the high-speed test flights, but the X-1's sturdy construction absorbed the punishment without complaint. Mach 0.9 brought increased vibration and the beginning of control difficulties. The stick grew heavy in Yeager's hands, and he had to fight to keep the aircraft level as invisible forces tried to flip it out of control. At Mach 0.95, the buffeting became severe enough to blur his vision and rattle his teeth. Instruments danced on their mounts, and warning lights flickered as electrical connections strained under the assault of continuous shock waves. This was the region where previous attempts to break the sound barrier had failed. The region where aircraft had torn themselves apart and pilots had died in screaming dives toward the unforgiving earth. But the X-1 held together, its bullet-shaped fuselage and knife-edged wings slicing through the turbulent air with minimal disturbance. Bell's engineers had done their job well. At Mach 0.96, something unexpected happened. The buffeting began to diminish. Yeager blinked sweat from his eyes and checked his instruments. The Mach-meter needle continued to climb, but the violent shaking that had characterized flight in the transonic region was fading away. The aircraft felt smoother, more controllable. For a moment he wondered if something had gone wrong with the instruments, but the airspeed indicator continued to climb, and the altimeter showed that he was still at 42,000 feet, flying straight and level. At Mach 0.98, the buffeting stopped entirely. The X-1 flew through the air as smoothly as if it were traveling at half the speed of sound. The controls responded normally to Yeager's inputs. The engine continued to roar behind him, pushing the aircraft faster and faster toward the theoretical wall that Soviet scientists had declared impermeable. At Mach 0.99, Yeager realized that he was about to make history. At Mach 1.0, he did. The Mach-meter needle swept past Mach 1 with no fanfare, no dramatic explosion, no catastrophic failure. The X-1 simply transitioned from subsonic to supersonic flight as smoothly as stepping from one room into another. Yeager was flying faster than sound itself. Behind him, the X-1's passage through the air created something that no human being had ever experienced firsthand: a sonic boom. The shock waves that had buffeted the aircraft so violently at Mach 0.9 had coalesced into a single powerful pressure wave that followed the X-1 like an invisible wake. But Yeager heard none of this. Inside the supersonic aircraft, he experienced only an eerie calm. The violent buffeting that had characterized transonic flight was gone, replaced by smooth, stable flight that felt almost anticlimactic after the drama of breaking through the sound barrier. On the ground at Muroc, the sonic boom arrived as a sharp crack that echoed off the mountains and rolled across the desert floor like thunder. Ground personnel looked up at the empty sky in confusion, thinking they had heard an explosion somewhere in the distance. But Yeager's radio call clarified the situation. "Say, Ridley, that Mach meter is acting up. It just went off the scale on me." Jack Ridley's response was characteristically understated. "Son of a bitch, Chuck. That's it." The year was 1945, and America stood victorious but vulnerable. We had won the greatest war in human history, dropped atomic fire on our enemies, and emerged as the most powerful nation on Earth. Yet beneath the ticker-tape parades and celebration, a gnawing anxiety had taken root in the American psyche. The Soviets were moving fast. Too fast. In research facilities across the USSR, scientists and engineers worked around the clock, fueled by vodka and ideology, racing to unlock the secrets that would propel their nation beyond the reach of American bombers. Radio Moscow crackled with boastful proclamations about Soviet technological supremacy, dismissing American achievements as capitalist propaganda and impossible fantasies. But it wasn't just the Soviets that haunted American engineers in those post-war years. It was something far more fundamental, far more terrifying than any external enemy. The laws of physics themselves seemed to be conspiring against human ambition. For the next minute, Yeager flew the X-1 in level supersonic flight, reaching a maximum speed of Mach 1.06, about 700 miles per hour at 42,000 feet altitude. The aircraft handled beautifully, responding to control inputs with precision and stability that would have been envied by the pilot of any conventional fighter. The sound barrier, that terrible wall of compressed air that had killed so many pilots and confounded so many engineers, simply did not exist at supersonic speeds. It was a transient phenomenon, a region of turbulent transition between two stable flight regimes. Like many barriers that had seemed absolute throughout human history, the sound barrier had proven to be an illusion created by incomplete understanding and insufficient technology. Once the right tools were developed and applied with sufficient skill and courage, the impossible became merely difficult. Yeager shut down the rocket engine and began his glide back to Muroc, savoring the moment of triumph, even as he prepared for the challenge of landing a dead-stick aircraft on the unforgiving surface of Rogers Dry Lake. The X-1 touched down smoothly, its skid-type landing gear designed specifically for the hard-packed alkali surface of the lakebed. Ground crews rushed to meet the aircraft, eager to examine the machine that had just shattered one of the most persistent myths in aviation history. But for all the excitement of the ground personnel, the flight itself had been almost routine from Yeager's perspective. It was just another day at the office, he would later say with characteristic modesty. The airplane flew fine, and I brought it back in one piece. That's about all there was to it. The X-1's supersonic flight was immediately classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. The Air Force wanted time to evaluate the implications of supersonic flight before announcing the achievement to the world. There were also practical considerations. If the Soviets learned too much about American supersonic technology, they might accelerate their own research programs. So Chuck Yeager's historic flight remained a secret, known only to the personnel directly involved in the X-1 program and a handful of senior military and government officials. For Yeager himself, the secrecy was almost a relief. He had never sought fame or public recognition, preferring to measure his success by the standards of his fellow test pilots rather than the approval of strangers. The knowledge that he had broken the sound barrier was satisfaction enough. But the secret couldn't be kept forever. Word of the X-1's success began to leak through the aerospace community, carried by engineers and test pilots who understood the magnitude of what had been achieved. Soviet intelligence services began picking up rumors of American supersonic flights, though they initially dismissed these reports as propaganda or wishful thinking. The truth would eventually emerge, as truth has a tendency to do. But for now, in the immediate aftermath of October 14, 1947, Chuck Yeager and the Bell X-1 team had accomplished something that the world's leading scientists had declared impossible. They had proven that the only barriers that truly exist are those we accept as permanent. The sonic boom that rolled across the Mojave Desert on October 14, 1947, was more than just a sound. It was the percussion of history changing direction. The shock wave that followed Chuck Yeager's X-1 through the sky carried with it the death rattle of an old world and the birth cry of a new one. For the ground crews at Muroc, the boom was initially mystifying. They had heard the sound of aircraft breaking up in flight before, the sharp crack of metal failing under stress, followed by the whistle of debris falling through thin air. But Yeager's voice on the radio was calm, professional, reporting instrument readings and flight characteristics with the same matter-of-fact tone he might have used to discuss the weather. It took several minutes for the full realization to sink in. The impossible had just become routine. Bob Hoover, another test pilot who had been circling the area in a chase plane, was among the first to understand what he had witnessed. "I saw that orange bullet punch through the sky," he later recalled, "and I knew everything had just changed. Not just for aviation, but for everything. We had just proven that the laws of physics weren't laws at all. They were just suggestions we hadn't figured out how to ignore yet." Jack Ridley, the flight engineer who had provided the sawed-off broom handle that made the flight possible, stood in the control room with tears streaming down his face. This was a man who had spent years calculating thrust-to-weight ratios and shockwave formations, who understood better than anyone how many things could have gone catastrophically wrong. The fact that Yeager was alive and the X-1 was intact seemed almost miraculous. Colonel Albert Boyd, the program director, allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction before turning his attention to the next challenge: how to keep the achievement secret long enough to exploit its strategic advantages. In Washington, news of the successful flight reached the highest levels of government within hours. President Harry Truman was briefed personally by Secretary of the Air Force Stuart Symington, who emphasized both the magnitude of the achievement and the need for absolute secrecy. The Cold War was entering its most dangerous phase. The Berlin blockade was still months away, but tensions between the United States and Soviet Union were escalating daily. Any technological advantage, no matter how small, could prove decisive in the struggle between two ideologies that seemed incapable of coexistence. Truman understood the implications immediately. American supersonic flight capability would revolutionize military aviation, making possible new generations of fighters and bombers that could penetrate enemy defenses with unprecedented speed. More importantly, it would demonstrate American technological superiority at a time when Soviet propaganda was claiming that communist science was destined to surpass capitalist achievements. But the president also recognized that premature revelation of the X-1's success could backfire. If the Soviets learned too much about American supersonic technology, they might accelerate their own programs or develop countermeasures. Better to keep the achievement secret while American engineers worked to translate the X-1's breakthrough into operational military aircraft. The decision was made. Chuck Yeager's flight would remain classified indefinitely. In Moscow, Soviet intelligence services were struggling to make sense of conflicting reports coming from American aviation circles. Radio intercepts suggested that something significant had happened at the mysterious test facility in California's Mojave Desert, but the details were fragmentary and often contradictory. The initial reaction from Soviet scientists was skeptical to the point of dismissal. Dr. Sergei Chaplygin, the Soviet Union's leading aerodynamicist, issued a statement declaring that American claims of supersonic flight are either propaganda lies or the result of measurement errors by incompetent technicians. Radio Moscow continued its campaign of mockery, broadcasting elaborate parodies of American boastfulness and technological fantasies. One particularly cutting commentary suggested that the Americans were so desperate for prestige that they would claim to have invented flight itself if they thought anyone would believe them. But privately, Soviet engineers were less confident. Captured German research had taught them to respect American technological capabilities, and the success of the Manhattan Project had demonstrated that the United States was capable of achieving seemingly impossible scientific breakthroughs. Alexander Yakovlev, designer of the Soviet Union's most advanced fighter aircraft, began quietly accelerating his own supersonic research programs. If the Americans had actually broken the sound barrier, the Soviet Union could not afford to fall behind in what might become the decisive technological competition of the Cold War. At Muroc Army Airfield, the X-1 team celebrated their triumph with characteristic understatement. There were no champagne toasts or victory parades, just handshakes, backslapping, and the quiet satisfaction of engineers and pilots who had solved an impossible problem through skill, courage, and determination. Chuck Yeager himself seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. He had done his job, flown his aircraft, and brought it back safely. From his perspective, the flight had been routine except for the speed involved. The X-1 had handled beautifully once it reached supersonic velocity, proving that Bell's designers had solved the fundamental problems of high-speed flight. But for the engineers who had spent years designing and building the X-1, the successful flight represented vindication of revolutionary theories about supersonic aerodynamics. Robert Woods, the chief designer, walked around the returned aircraft with the reverent air of a man examining a religious relic. Every rivet was still in place. Every control surface was intact. The rocket engine showed no signs of damage or unusual wear. The orange paint job was unmarked except for a few scorch marks around the engine nozzles, battle scars from the violence of rocket propulsion. Most remarkably, the X-1's structure showed no signs of the catastrophic damage that aerodynamicists had predicted would result from supersonic flight. The shock waves that had seemed so threatening in wind tunnel tests had proved manageable in actual flight, contained and channeled by the aircraft's carefully shaped surfaces. Beyond the symbolic importance of breaking the sound barrier, Yeager's flight had generated an enormous amount of technical data that would revolutionize aircraft design. Every instrument in the X-1's cockpit had recorded the aircraft's behavior during its transition to supersonic flight, creating the first comprehensive picture of what actually happened when an aircraft exceeded Mach 1. The data revealed that many theoretical predictions about supersonic flight had been wrong. The shock waves that formed around the aircraft at Mach 1 were intense, but manageable. The control problems that had plagued transonic flight largely disappeared once the aircraft reached truly supersonic speeds. Most importantly, the power required to maintain supersonic flight was less than many scientists had predicted. These discoveries would lead directly to the development of operational supersonic aircraft. The data from Yeager's flight provided the foundation for designing the F-86 Sabre, the first American fighter capable of supersonic flight in a dive. Later, it would contribute to the development of the Century Series fighters, the F-100, F-101, F-102, and others that would dominate American military aviation in the 1950s. But perhaps the most important lesson from the X-1 program was philosophical rather than technical. The demonstration that scientific consensus could be wrong, that barriers believed to be absolute could prove to be temporary obstacles, and that human courage and ingenuity could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Despite the military's best efforts to maintain secrecy, word of the X-1's achievement began to spread through the tight-knit community of aviation professionals. Test pilots talked to other test pilots. Engineers shared technical insights with colleagues at other companies. Reporters began asking pointed questions about activities at Muroc Army Airfield. The first public hint of the supersonic flight came in December 1947, when Aviation Week magazine published a brief item suggesting that recent flight tests in the Southwest may have achieved velocities significantly in excess of previous records. The article was deliberately vague, but knowledgeable readers understood its implications. Soviet intelligence services took note of the Aviation Week article and began pressing their sources in the American aviation industry for more detailed information. The fact that American officials refused to comment on the reports only increased Soviet suspicions that something significant had occurred. In January 1948, a more detailed account appeared in the Los Angeles Times, reporting that an unnamed test pilot had exceeded the speed of sound in level flight while flying an experimental aircraft at a classified location in California. The story was picked up by newspapers across the country, though most editors treated it as speculation rather than confirmed fact. The Soviet response was swift and predictable. Radio Moscow denounced the reports as typical American propaganda, designed to intimidate peace-loving nations with fictional weapons of war. But privately, Soviet leaders were beginning to take the claims seriously enough to launch crash programs aimed at developing their own supersonic aircraft. By June 1948, the secret had become impossible to maintain. Too many people knew the truth, and the strategic value of continued secrecy was beginning to diminish as American aircraft manufacturers incorporated lessons learned from the X-1 program into new military designs. The Air Force finally decided to make the achievement public, but on their own terms. On June 10, 1948, more than 8 months after Yeager's historic flight, the military released an official statement confirming that an experimental aircraft designated X-1 achieved supersonic flight on October 14, 1947, with Captain Charles E. Yeager as pilot. The announcement was deliberately low-key, released on a Friday afternoon when it would receive minimal press coverage. Military officials hoped to minimize the publicity surrounding the flight while still receiving credit for the achievement. But the strategy backfired. The fact that the American military had kept such a significant achievement secret for 8 months only heightened public interest in the story. Chuck Yeager, who had hoped to remain anonymous, suddenly found himself thrust into the spotlight as the first human being to fly faster than sound. International reaction to the X-1 announcement was swift and varied. Allied nations praised American technological achievement while quietly accelerating their own supersonic research programs. Neutral countries saw the breakthrough as evidence that the Cold War was entering a new phase of technological competition. Enemy nations denounced it as warmongering while desperately trying to duplicate American success. In Britain, where Jeffrey de Havilland Jr. had died attempting to break the sound barrier, there was grudging admiration mixed with disappointment that an American pilot had achieved what British aviation had failed to accomplish. The Royal Aircraft Establishment immediately launched new programs aimed at developing British supersonic aircraft. French aviation authorities, still rebuilding their aircraft industry after the devastation of World War II, recognized that they were falling behind in the technological competition that would define post-war military aviation. The French government began negotiations with American companies for access to supersonic flight technology. But it was the Soviet reaction that mattered most for American strategic planners. Despite public denunciations of the X-1 achievement as capitalist propaganda, Soviet actions revealed that they took the American breakthrough very seriously indeed. Since the dawn of aviation, pilots had been pushing their machines faster and higher, chasing the horizon of human possibility. But as they approached the speed of sound, roughly 767 miles per hour at sea level, something sinister began to happen. The air itself seemed to rebel. At around 600 miles per hour, strange vibrations would grip an aircraft like invisible hands. The controls would stiffen, then freeze entirely. Instruments would rattle themselves into uselessness. Wings would twist and buckle under forces that defied understanding. Pilots who survived these encounters spoke in hushed, almost mystical terms about what they experienced. The controls froze solid, reported one British test pilot. It was as if the air had turned to concrete. Another described the sensation as flying into a wall made of wind. The deaths began to mount. Jeffrey de Havilland Jr., son of the famous aircraft designer, was torn apart along with his DH-1008 when he attempted to reach Mach 1 in 1946. The wreckage was scattered across the English countryside like confetti, pieces no larger than a man's fist. German test pilot Hans Guido Muttke claimed to have broken the sound barrier during the war. But the evidence was disputed, and Muttke himself admitted he nearly died in the attempt. Scientists had a name for this phenomenon: the sound barrier. But the word barrier carried weight beyond its scientific meaning. It implied something absolute, something final, a wall that nature herself had erected to keep mankind in his proper place. Within weeks of the official announcement of Yeager's flight, Soviet aircraft design bureaus received urgent directives to accelerate supersonic research programs. The MiG Design Bureau, led by Artem Mikoyan and Mikhail Gurevich, was ordered to develop a supersonic fighter capable of matching or exceeding American capabilities. The Sukhoi Design Bureau received similar orders, as did the Yakovlev and Lavochkin organizations. Soviet leaders were determined not to allow America to maintain a monopoly on supersonic flight technology. But the Soviet Union faced significant disadvantages in the supersonic race. American aircraft manufacturers had access to captured German research on high-speed flight, as well as the extensive wind tunnel facilities and testing equipment that had been developed during World War II. More importantly, they had the data from actual supersonic flight, courtesy of Chuck Yeager and the X-1 program. Soviet engineers would have to develop supersonic flight technology largely from scratch, relying on theoretical calculations and wind tunnel tests rather than actual flight experience. It would take them several years to achieve what American engineers had accomplished in 1947. Beyond its technical and military implications, the X-1's breakthrough had a profound psychological effect on American society. The successful flight came at a time when many Americans were beginning to doubt their nation's technological superiority. Soviet achievements in nuclear weapons and missile technology had shaken American confidence, creating a sense that the United States was falling behind in the scientific competition that would determine Cold War outcomes. Chuck Yeager's flight changed that perception overnight. Here was proof that American engineers and pilots could still achieve the impossible, that the nation that had won World War II and developed the atomic bomb retained its capacity for technological breakthrough. The achievement also reinforced certain myths about American character that would prove influential in the coming decades. The image of Yeager as a lone pilot conquering the sky through individual courage and skill resonated with traditional American narratives about frontier heroes and rugged individualism. This mythologizing of the test pilot would have far-reaching consequences, influencing everything from the selection of astronauts for the space program to popular culture representations of aviation and exploration. The X-1 flight helped establish the test pilot as a uniquely American hero, part scientist, part cowboy, part explorer. By 1949, the sonic boom had become more than just an acoustic phenomenon. It was the signature sound of American technological supremacy. As news of Chuck Yeager's achievement spread around the globe, the sharp crack that had echoed across the Mojave Desert on October 14, 1947, took on symbolic significance far beyond its scientific importance. In American newspapers and magazines, the sonic boom was described in almost mystical terms. Time magazine called it the thunder of the future, while Life referred to it as the sound of barriers crumbling. Popular mechanics magazines published detailed explanations of shockwave formation, accompanied by dramatic illustrations showing X-1 aircraft piercing walls of compressed air. But the boom's impact extended far beyond American shores. In capitals around the world, political and military leaders were forced to confront the reality that the strategic balance of power had shifted. An aircraft that could fly faster than sound could potentially penetrate any existing air defense system, reaching targets before radar operators could even detect its approach. The psychological effect was perhaps even more significant than the military implications. For centuries, the speed of sound had represented a fundamental limit on human velocity. Breaking that barrier suggested that other limits, including the ultimate frontier of space travel, might also prove to be temporary obstacles rather than permanent boundaries. In Moscow, the initial Soviet reaction of dismissive mockery gave way to barely controlled panic as the reality of American supersonic capability became undeniable. Soviet intelligence services launched desperate efforts to obtain detailed information about X-1 technology, while aircraft design bureaus received urgent directives to accelerate supersonic research programs. The Soviet response revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the communist system. On one hand, The centralized command structure allowed for rapid mobilization of resources and talent. Within months of the X-1 announcement, thousands of engineers, technicians, and scientists were reassigned to supersonic aircraft projects. Sergei Korolev, who would later become famous as the chief designer of the Soviet space program, was among those tasked with developing supersonic flight technology. Working with captured German rocket scientists and equipment, Korolev began developing rocket engines that could power Soviet aircraft to supersonic speeds. But the Soviet system also suffered from significant disadvantages in the supersonic race. The secrecy that surrounded the X-1 program had prevented Soviet intelligence from gathering detailed technical information about American achievements. Soviet engineers were forced to develop their own solutions to problems that American designers had already solved, leading to delays and inefficiencies. More fundamentally, the Soviet aviation industry lacked the depth of experience and manufacturing capability that characterized American aircraft production. While Soviet designers were capable of creating innovative prototypes, they often struggled to translate experimental successes into operational military aircraft. The announcement of Yeager's flight triggered a global race to develop operational supersonic aircraft. In the United States, the success of the X-1 program led to immediate military contracts for supersonic fighters and bombers. North American aviation received funding to develop the F-86 Sabre, which would become the first American fighter capable of supersonic flight in a dive. Lockheed began work on the F-104 Starfighter, designed to achieve sustained supersonic flight in level flight. Convair started development of the F-102 Delta Dagger, an interceptor intended to defend against Soviet supersonic bombers that did not yet exist but were assumed to be in development. The American aircraft industry, already the world's largest and most technically advanced, benefited enormously from the X-1 program's success. Companies that had contributed to the supersonic breakthrough found themselves in high demand, receiving lucrative contracts to apply their expertise to military aircraft development. Bell Aircraft, the X-1's manufacturer, became a major player in the supersonic aircraft market despite its relatively small size. The company's experience with rocket-powered flight led to contracts for the X-2, X-5, and other experimental aircraft that would push the boundaries of high-speed flight even further. But perhaps the most significant beneficiary of the X-1's success was Chuck Yeager himself, though he seemed largely unaware of his growing fame. The test pilot, who had broken the sound barrier with characteristic modesty, found himself transformed into a national hero, a symbol of American technological prowess and individual courage. The X-1's breakthrough had implications that extended far beyond military aviation. In boardrooms and government offices around the world, leaders began to recognize that supersonic flight would revolutionize civilian transportation as well as military operations. British aircraft manufacturers, stung by their failure to achieve supersonic flight first, launched ambitious programs to develop supersonic airliners. The project that would eventually become the Concorde began as a direct response to American supersonic achievements, an attempt to reclaim British leadership in aviation technology. French aviation authorities, recognizing that they lacked the resources to compete independently with American and British supersonic programs, began exploring international partnerships. The Anglo-French collaboration that produced the Concorde was partly motivated by the need to pool resources in the face of American technological dominance. Even nations with limited aviation industries felt compelled to develop supersonic capabilities. Sweden, Switzerland, and Canada all launched supersonic aircraft programs, often in partnership with larger nations or aircraft manufacturers. The success of the X-1 program also triggered a fundamental shift in the economics of aircraft development. Supersonic flight required entirely new approaches to aerodynamics, materials science, and propulsion technology. The costs involved in developing these capabilities were enormous, leading to unprecedented levels of government funding for aviation research. In the United States, the success of the X-1 led to the creation of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, which would later become NASA. The organization's mission was to coordinate government-funded research into high-speed flight, ensuring that American technological leadership would be maintained in the face of international competition. The economic implications extended beyond government spending. Airlines began planning for a future in which supersonic flight would revolutionize passenger transportation. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed all began preliminary design studies for supersonic airliners that could cross the Atlantic in hours rather than days. Aircraft manufacturers invested heavily in new production facilities designed to handle the exotic materials and precision manufacturing techniques required for supersonic aircraft. The aluminum alloys and steel construction techniques that had dominated aviation since the Wright brothers gave way to titanium, exotic composites, and manufacturing processes borrowed from the aerospace industry. Perhaps the most unexpected consequence of the X-1 success was its impact on American popular culture. Chuck Yeager's achievement captured the public imagination in ways that no one had anticipated, inspiring a generation of young Americans to pursue careers in aviation and aerospace engineering. Hollywood discovered the dramatic potential of test pilot stories, producing a series of films that romanticized the dangers and excitement of experimental flight. The Right Stuff, both Tom Wolfe's book and Philip Kaufman's film adaptation, would later immortalize Yeager and his fellow test pilots as uniquely American heroes. The sonic boom itself became a cultural phenomenon, inspiring everything from popular music to advertising campaigns. The sharp crack that followed supersonic aircraft was interpreted as the sound of progress itself, the acoustic signature of a nation that refused to accept limits on human achievement. Comic books and science fiction stories seized on the X-1's success as proof that the technological marvels they had long depicted were actually achievable. Supersonic flight became a stepping stone to even more ambitious projects. Rocket ships to the moon, underwater cities, and flying cars for every American family. The X-1 program's most lasting impact may have been its role in establishing the philosophical and technological foundation for space exploration. The rocket-powered aircraft that broke the sound barrier used many of the same technologies that would later propel Americans to the moon. More importantly, the X-1 program demonstrated that seemingly impossible challenges could be overcome through careful engineering, systematic testing, and individual courage. This lesson would prove invaluable when American leaders decided to compete with the Soviet Union in the ultimate frontier, space itself. Many of the engineers who worked on the X-1 program later joined NASA and contributed to the development of the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. The systematic approach to test flying that had been pioneered at Muroc became the standard methodology for astronaut training and spacecraft development. Chuck Yeager himself, though he never flew in space, became a mentor and inspiration to the test pilots who would become the first American astronauts. His example of calm professionalism under extreme stress established the template for the kind of person who could be trusted with multi-million-dollar spacecraft and the prestige of the American space program. By 1950, Soviet aircraft designers had made significant progress toward developing their own supersonic aircraft. The MiG-15, though not capable of sustained supersonic flight, could exceed Mach 1 in a dive. More advanced designs were on the drawing boards, incorporating lessons learned from captured German research and indigenous Soviet innovations. But the Soviets were still playing catch-up to American achievements. While Soviet propaganda continued to claim technological superiority, privately Soviet leaders recognized that they had fallen behind in the supersonic race. This recognition would later motivate the massive investments in space technology that led to Soviet victories in the early years of the space race. The Soviet Union's eventual success in launching Sputnik and putting Yuri Gagarin into orbit can be traced, at least in part, to the shock of American supersonic achievements in the late 1940s. Soviet leaders were determined not to be caught off guard again by American technological breakthroughs. At research centers across America, aerodynamicists worked feverishly to understand what was happening in those final moments before an aircraft reached Mach 1. They covered blackboards with equations, built wind tunnels that screamed like banshees, and tested model after model until their funding ran dry and their hopes dimmed. The problem, they discovered, was compression. As an aircraft approaches the speed of sound, the air in front of it can no longer get out of the way fast enough. It begins to compress, forming shock waves that create tremendous drag and violent turbulence. These shock waves seemed to grow stronger as speed increased, until they became an impenetrable wall of resistance. Theodor von Karman, the brilliant Hungarian-American aerodynamicist, expressed the prevailing view with characteristic precision. "We have reached the limits of what is aerodynamically possible with current aircraft design. The sound barrier represents a fundamental boundary in physics that cannot be crossed without revolutionary changes in our understanding of flight." Other scientists were even more pessimistic. Some suggested that breaking the sound barrier would require more power than any engine could possibly produce. Others theorized that the shock waves would literally tear apart any aircraft that attempted the feat, scattering its remains across the landscape like deadly rain. But perhaps the most chilling assessment came from Dr. W. F. Hilton of the National Physical Laboratory in Britain, who published a paper in 1947 concluding that supersonic flight was not merely difficult, but physically impossible for conventional aircraft. Hilton's calculations suggested that the power required to overcome the sound barrier would increase exponentially as an aircraft approached Mach 1, creating an insurmountable wall of energy requirements. By 1950, the Bell X-1 had completed its active testing program and was retired to the Smithsonian Institution, where it remains on display today. But the aircraft's influence on aviation and aerospace development continued long after its final flight. The X-1 program established many of the principles and procedures that would govern experimental flight testing for decades to come. The systematic approach to pushing aircraft performance boundaries, the use of chase planes and ground monitoring, and the careful documentation of flight test results all became standard practices in the industry. Perhaps most importantly, the X-1 program demonstrated that American engineers and pilots could achieve technological breakthroughs that their foreign competitors considered impossible. This confidence would prove crucial in the coming decades, as the United States faced increasingly sophisticated challenges from the Soviet Union and other nations. The orange bullet that had screamed across the Mojave Desert on October 14, 1947, had done more than break the sound barrier. It had shattered the myth of technological impossibility and established America as the world leader in advanced aviation technology. Chuck Yeager never sought fame, but fame found him anyway. In the years following his historic flight, the test pilot from West Virginia became a reluctant symbol of American technological achievement and individual courage. He appeared on magazine covers, gave speeches at Air Force Academy graduations, and served as an inspiration to countless young Americans who dreamed of pushing the boundaries of human possibility. Yet Yeager himself remained remarkably unchanged by his celebrity. He continued flying experimental aircraft, serving as a test pilot for increasingly sophisticated supersonic designs. His logbook eventually recorded flights in more than 150 different aircraft types, from primitive biplanes to the most advanced jets of the Cold War era. When asked about his place in aviation history, Yeager's response was characteristically modest. "I was just flying a plane. The sound barrier was a myth until we made it real. Any good pilot could have done what I did, given the right airplane and the right circumstances." But those who worked with Yeager knew that his contribution went far beyond simply being in the right place at the right time. His intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior, his calm professionalism under extreme stress, and his willingness to risk his life in pursuit of scientific knowledge had made possible one of the greatest achievements in aviation history. The success of the X-1 program set in motion a chain of events that would transform not only aviation, but the entire trajectory of human technological development. The confidence gained from breaking the sound barrier emboldened American leaders to attempt even more ambitious projects. Within a decade of Yeager's flight, American aircraft were routinely flying at twice the speed of sound. The Century Series fighters, the F-100 Super Sabre, F-101 Voodoo, F-102 Delta Dagger, F-104 Starfighter, F-105 Thunder Chief, and F-106 Delta Dart, all traced their lineage back to the lessons learned from the X-1 program. The same rocket technology that had powered the X-1 to supersonic speeds was scaled up and refined to create the engines that would eventually propel American astronauts to the moon. The systematic approach to test flying that had been pioneered at Muroc became the foundation for astronaut training and spacecraft development. Perhaps most importantly, the X-1 program demonstrated that American engineering and manufacturing capabilities could produce solutions to problems that the world's leading scientists had declared unsolvable. This confidence would prove crucial when President Kennedy committed the nation to landing on the moon before the end of the 1960s. In Moscow, the long-term implications of the X-1's success were slowly becoming apparent to Soviet leaders. The American breakthrough in supersonic flight had revealed dangerous gaps in Soviet technological capabilities, gaps that could prove decisive in any future conflict between the superpowers. By 1955, Soviet aircraft designers had succeeded in developing their own supersonic fighters, but they were still several years behind American achievements. The MiG-19, the Soviet Union's first production supersonic fighter, did not enter service until 1955, 8 years after Yeager's flight. The Soviet response to this technological gap was characteristically ambitious, a massive investment in space technology that would eventually produce Sputnik, Laika, and Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight. Soviet leaders reasoned that if they could not match American achievements in atmospheric flight, they would leapfrog ahead into the ultimate frontier of space itself. This strategy succeeded brilliantly in the short term, giving the Soviet Union a series of spectacular propaganda victories in the early years of the space race. But it also revealed the fundamental weakness of the Soviet system: the inability to maintain technological leadership across multiple domains simultaneously. While Soviet engineers focused their efforts on space achievements, American aircraft manufacturers continued to push the boundaries of atmospheric flight. By the 1960s, American aircraft like the SR-71 Blackbird were achieving speeds and altitudes that Soviet designs could not match. The X-1's success coincided with and contributed to a fundamental transformation in American society. The nation that had emerged victorious from World War II was beginning to define itself not just by its military power or economic strength, but by its technological capabilities and willingness to attempt seemingly impossible challenges. This shift in national identity would have profound consequences in the decades that followed. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, shocking American leaders with evidence of Soviet technological achievement, the response was swift and decisive. A massive investment in science and technology education, the creation of NASA, and a commitment to regain technological leadership through superior engineering and innovation. The confidence that made this response possible can be traced directly back to Chuck Yeager's flight on October 14, 1947. The knowledge that American engineers and pilots had broken the sound barrier when everyone else said it was impossible created a sense of national capability that would drive American achievements in space exploration, computer technology, and countless other fields. Despite decades of analysis and countless books about the X-1 program, one mystery remains. Why did Chuck Yeager succeed where so many others had failed? The technical explanations are clear enough. Bell Aircraft's superior design, the rocket engine's power and efficiency, the systematic approach to test flying. But these factors alone cannot fully explain why one man in one aircraft achieved a breakthrough that had eluded the world's best engineers and pilots. Perhaps the answer lies in the unique combination of factors that came together on that October morning in 1947. The right aircraft, flown by the right pilot at the right moment in history, when American confidence and technological capability had reached a critical mass that made the impossible seem merely difficult. Or perhaps the answer is simpler. Some barriers exist only until someone is brave enough to break them. The sound barrier was real enough. It killed pilots and destroyed aircraft throughout the 1940s. But it was not an absolute limit imposed by the laws of physics. It was a challenge waiting for the right combination of engineering skill, pilot courage, and national determination. The sonic boom that rolled across the Mojave Desert on October 14, 1947, was more than just the acoustic signature of supersonic flight. It was the sound of the future arriving ahead of schedule, the percussion of human ambition colliding with natural law and emerging victorious. In the years that followed, sonic booms became commonplace as supersonic aircraft proliferated around the world. But that first boom, the one that announced Chuck Yeager's passage into aviation immortality, remains unique in human history. It was the sound of a barrier breaking, a limitation dissolving, a new age beginning. Today, nearly 8 decades after Yeager's flight, the X-1 hangs in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Its orange paint faded, but its significance undiminished. Visitors from around the world come to see the small aircraft that proved the experts wrong and opened the door to the space age. But the X-1's true legacy lies not in any museum display. It lives in every supersonic aircraft that has followed, every rocket that has reached orbit, every spacecraft that has carried human beings beyond the atmosphere. It lives in the knowledge that the only barriers that truly limit human achievement are those we accept as permanent. Chuck Yeager flew his last official test flight in 1975, but he continued flying for pleasure well into his 90s. When asked about his legacy, his response was characteristic. "I just wanted to fly fast airplanes. Everything else was somebody else's idea." But Yeager's modesty could not diminish the magnitude of what he and the X-1 team had accomplished. On October 14, 1947, they had proven that courage and competence could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. They had demonstrated that American engineering and pilot skill could achieve what the world's leading scientists had declared impossible. Most importantly, they had established a precedent that would inspire American achievements for generations to come. When President Kennedy announced the goal of landing on the moon, when NASA engineers designed spacecraft to carry humans to other worlds, when American entrepreneurs began developing private spacecraft for commercial space travel, they were all following the example set by a young test pilot and an orange bullet-shaped aircraft over the Mojave Desert in 1947. The Soviets had said it couldn't be done. The experts had declared it impossible. The laws of physics themselves seemed to forbid it. But Chuck Yeager and the Bell X-1 didn't argue with the skeptics. They simply climbed into the sky and flew faster than sound itself, proving once again that the most powerful barriers are often the ones that exist only in our minds. The sonic boom that announced their success continues to echo through history, a reminder that human achievement has no limits except those we impose upon ourselves. In breaking the sound barrier, they had done more than achieve a technological milestone. They had demonstrated the unlimited potential of human courage, ingenuity, and determination. That lesson remains as relevant today as it was on that October morning in 1947, when the sky cracked open and the future came roaring through. In Moscow, Soviet engineers read these reports with barely concealed glee. Radio Moscow began broadcasting regular commentaries ridiculing American attempts to achieve supersonic flight. "The capitalists," sneered one broadcaster, "seek to conquer nature herself with their crude machines and reckless ambition. But the laws of physics recognize no national boundaries. The Americans will learn, as we all must learn, that some frontiers are not meant to be crossed." Pravda published cartoon after cartoon showing American aircraft exploding in mid-air, their pilots ejecting with expressions of comic terror. One particularly cutting image showed Uncle Sam riding a rocket-powered airplane directly into a brick wall labeled "Sound Barrier," his top hat flying off as he crashed in a cloud of stars and stripes. The Soviet Academy of Sciences issued an official statement declaring that the sound barrier represents an absolute limit imposed by nature on the velocity of atmospheric flight. Any attempt to exceed this limit will result in the immediate destruction of both aircraft and pilot. These taunts stung American pride more than any military defeat. Here was the nation that had developed the atomic bomb, that had produced the most advanced aircraft of World War II, that had demonstrated technological supremacy on every battlefield from Normandy to the Pacific, being mocked by Soviet propagandists for chasing an impossible dream. But the mockery had an unexpected effect. Rather than discouraging American researchers, it galvanized them. In the corridors of the Pentagon, a small group of Air Force officers began to envision something unprecedented, an aircraft designed specifically to break the sound barrier, not as a side effect of pursuing other goals, but as its singular obsessive purpose. The concept was radical in its simplicity. Instead of trying to adapt existing aircraft to fly faster, why not design something entirely new? Something that would treat the sound barrier not as an insurmountable obstacle, but as a target to be systematically destroyed. Colonel Albert Boyd, chief of the Flight Test Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, became the project's most vocal advocate. Boyd had seen too many good pilots die attempting to push conventional aircraft beyond their limits. He believed that the only way to break the sound barrier safely was to engineer a solution from the ground up. "We need to stop thinking like aircraft designers," Boyd told his superiors, "and start thinking like bullet designers." The metaphor was apt. Bullets routinely exceeded the speed of sound. Artillery shells broke Mach 1 every time they were fired. Even the crack of a whip involved supersonic velocities. Nature had not forbidden supersonic travel. She had simply made it extraordinarily difficult for objects the size and complexity of aircraft. But bullets didn't need to carry pilots. They didn't need to land safely or fly again. They existed for one violent, transformative moment, then ceased to matter. Could an aircraft be designed to function like a bullet, but one that could bring its pilot home alive? The Pentagon approached several aircraft manufacturers with their radical proposal. Most declined immediately. Lockheed, Republic, and North American Aviation all considered the project too risky, too expensive, and too likely to end in catastrophic failure. But Larry Bell, the scrappy founder of Bell Aircraft Corporation, saw something different in the proposal. Bell had built a reputation for taking on projects that other manufacturers considered impossible. During the war, they had produced the P-39 Airacobra, an innovative fighter with its engine mounted behind the pilot. They had developed the first American jet aircraft, the P-59 Aerocomet. Bell thrived on challenges that made other companies nervous. More importantly, Bell had been quietly conducting research into supersonic flight since 1943. Their engineers had studied German research captured during the war, analyzed wind tunnel data from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and developed their own theories about how to design an aircraft capable of breaking the sound barrier. Robert Woods, Bell's chief designer, had become obsessed with the aerodynamics of high-speed flight. He covered the walls of his office with photographs of bullets, artillery shells, and other supersonic projectiles, searching for clues about how to shape an aircraft that could slip through the sonic wall. The solution, Woods believed, lay in fundamental design philosophy. Instead of starting with a conventional aircraft and modifying it for high speed, they would start with the physics of supersonic flight and build an aircraft around those requirements. The aircraft that emerged from Bell's design studios looked like nothing that had ever flown. Designated the XS-1, later shortened to X-1, it resembled a .50 caliber bullet with stubby wings and a needle-sharp nose. The fuselage was perfectly cylindrical, tapering to a knife-edge point at the front and rear. Every curve had been calculated to minimize drag and reduce the formation of shock waves. The wings were almost insultingly small, thin, straight, and sharp-edged like knife blades. Conventional wisdom held that aircraft needed large wings to generate sufficient lift, but the X-1's designers had discovered that large wings created enormous drag at high speeds. Better to accept reduced lift at low speeds in exchange for the ability to slip through the air like an arrow. Most radical of all was the decision to abandon traditional propeller or jet engines in favor of a rocket motor. Rocket engines could produce enormous thrust in the thin air of high altitude, where the speed of sound was lower and the sound barrier theoretically easier to break. They could also accelerate an aircraft to supersonic speeds in a matter of seconds, before the worst effects of transonic flight could take hold. But rockets consumed fuel at a voracious rate, limiting flight time to mere minutes. The X-1 would not take off from the ground like a normal aircraft. Instead, it would be carried aloft beneath a modified B-29 bomber and released at 20,000 feet, then fire its rockets to climb into the stratosphere. The entire aircraft was painted bright orange, partly for visibility during test flights, but also as a symbol of its radical purpose. This was not a military aircraft in any conventional sense. It was a scientific instrument, a probe designed to penetrate the unknown regions of high-speed flight and return with data about what lay beyond the sound barrier. As Bell's engineers refined their bullet-shaped aircraft, the Air Force began searching for a pilot brave enough, or perhaps crazy enough, to climb into the tiny cockpit and ride it into the unknown. The requirements were unusual. The pilot needed exceptional flying skills, obviously, but also a peculiar form of courage that could function in the face of scientific uncertainty. Unlike combat pilots, who faced human enemies with known capabilities, the X-1 pilot would be fighting the laws of physics themselves. Several test pilots were considered and rejected. Some lacked the technical knowledge to understand the complex systems of an experimental aircraft. Others were deemed too cautious, too likely to abandon the mission if conditions became dangerous. Then someone suggested Chuck Yeager. Charles Elwood Yeager was 24 years old, a farm boy from West Virginia who had enlisted in the Army Air Corps as a mechanic and worked his way up to become one of the most skilled fighter pilots of World War II. Flying P-51 Mustangs over Europe, Yeager had shot down 11 German aircraft, including a Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, one of the first jet-versus-jet kills in aviation history. More importantly for the X-1 project, Yeager had a reputation for calm competence under pressure. His squadron mates described him as unnaturally cool in combat, a pilot who could assess dangerous situations with scientific precision while bullets were cracking past his canopy. Yeager also possessed something even rarer than courage, an intuitive understanding of how aircraft behaved at the extremes of performance. He could feel when a plane was approaching its limits, sense the subtle changes in vibration and control response that preceded catastrophic failure. This almost mystical ability to commune with his aircraft had kept him alive through dozens of combat missions and earned him the respect of every pilot who flew with him. When Colonel Boyd offered him the chance to fly the X-1, Yeager's response was characteristically understated. "Sounds interesting. When do we start?"